These chimpanzees once lived as a single group. Now they hunt one another. Several males surround a former ally, wrestle him to the ground, and don't simply kill him, they keep attacking until there's almost nothing left. They tear infants from their mothers, return to the same territory again and again, and gradually wipe out an entire half of the group they once belonged to. And this isn't some ancient story or a single isolated incident. The war's going on right now, and the attacks are becoming increasingly brutal. Some of the most recent happened this year, in 2026, in case you're watching this at some point in the future. But the strangest part came later. The chimpanzees began doing things researchers had almost never seen before. They attacked individuals they had grown up with, killed those who posed no threat, and sometimes treated the bodies as though just killing them wasn't enough. And the longer scientists observed this group, the less it looked like an ordinary territorial conflict. Because the chimpanzees were no longer simply killing their enemies, they'd started a war that could destroy their own society. The war is unfolding in Kabale National Park in Uganda. For nearly 30 years, researchers have been observing the Ngogo chimpanzees, one of the largest known communities of these primates. Until recently, it had around 200 individuals who freely formed smaller parties, split up, and later came back together. But around 2015, two stable factions began to emerge within Ngogo, the Western and Central groups. At first, it didn't look anything like a war. The chimpanzees simply spent less time together, and by 2018, the two halves were effectively living as separate communities. Aggression spiked along the border between their territories. Such attacks are not in themselves unusual for chimpanzees. Males patrol territorial boundaries, pursue outsiders, and sometimes kill members of neighboring groups. The Ngogo chimpanzees had done this before. But now their enemies were no longer strangers. They were chimpanzees who, only a few years earlier, had belonged to the same community. That's why researchers compare what's happening to a civil war. Chimpanzees don't have countries or political parties, of course, but the opposing sides know one another. Some of them grew up together, socialized, and maintained close relationships for years. At first, the clashes took place during patrols. Chimpanzees searched for members of the opposing side and attacked whenever they had numbers on their side. Then adult males began to die. And starting in 2021, researchers began regularly documenting the killing of infants. The war didn't end when the original study did. New attacks occurred in both 2025 and 2026. What makes this especially remarkable is that scientists were able to watch almost in real time as former allies became enemies. Since the Ngogo chimpanzees had been observed for decades, researchers knew who socialized with who spent time together, and who maintained close bonds. And they discovered that the war had begun long before the first killing. Around the same time that the community began splitting in two, it also experienced a change in leadership. In 2015, a new alpha male took over. His name was Jackson, and his rise mattered more than it might seem. For chimpanzees, the arrival of a new alpha is not simply a matter of replacing one strong male with another. The largest and strongest chimpanzee doesn't necessarily become the leader. Allies are often far more important. Males support one another during conflicts, join forces against rivals, and may maintain such coalitions for years. As a result, a weaker contender backed by the right partners can defeat a much more powerful opponent. In other words, to become the top chimpanzee, you don't always have to be the strongest. Sometimes you simply need to be friends with those who will be by your side when the moment comes. But the power shift alone can't explain the war. Chimpanzee leaders change all the time without former allies suddenly turning on and killing one another. Something else must have been happening at the same time. In fact, losing power can mean far more for a chimpanzee than simply dropping down the hierarchy. One of the best-known examples involved a male named Fadoko in Senegal. When researchers first began observing the group, Fadoko was its alpha male. But he didn't hold power alone. At his side was his closest ally, Mamadou, the group's second-ranking male. In 2007, Mamadou suffered a severe leg injury and quickly dropped in rank. As his position weakened, Fadoko began losing influence as well. The younger males formed an alliance against their former leader and eventually drove him out of the group. After his exile, Fadoko disappeared, and the researchers assumed he was dead. But 9 months later, the former alpha unexpectedly returned. This time, however, he stayed near the edges of the group's territory, hiding and trying to avoid the young males who'd once overthrown him. This went on for about 5 years. From time to time, Fadoku tried to approach the group again and rebuild his relationships, but the younger males repeatedly chased him away. Then, in the summer of 2013, it came to an end. Early one morning, the researchers heard screams and commotion coming from the group. By the time they reached the scene, Fadoku was already dead. After examining his injuries, the scientists concluded that several chimpanzees may have held Fadoku down while the others attacked him, and the assault didn't stop after he died. Both males and females continued biting and tearing at the former leader's body, and some of them even began to eat it. More often, though, chimpanzees turn their deadly aggression outward against neighboring groups, and they don't always wait for a chance encounter. Males regularly travel to the edges of their territory on organized patrols. During these patrols, their behavior changes dramatically. Chimpanzees are normally quite noisy and may spread out through the forest in small groups. But on patrol, they stay close together, move in single file, and become almost completely silent. They listen carefully and search for any sign that a neighboring group is nearby. Sometimes the patrol simply follows the boundary of its own territory. At other times, it crosses into territory belonging to another group. And here's the most interesting part. When chimpanzees encounter their neighbors, they don't always attack immediately. First, they need to figure out how many opponents are nearby. If the rival group is large, the patrol may retreat. But if a chimpanzee's been caught alone or the neighboring group is clearly smaller, the situation changes. Several males surround the victim and attack at the same time. But even after reaching the border, the chimpanzees don't necessarily move forward right away. Sometimes they first climb to higher ground. Researchers observed this behavior in 2 neighboring chimpanzee groups in Tai National Park in Côte d'Ivoire. When the animals were heading toward the disputed border, they were more than twice as likely to climb hills as they were when moving deeper into their own territory. Once they reached the top, their behavior changed again. Instead of feeding or continuing on, the chimpanzees were more likely to stop and rest quietly. The researchers believe this made it easier for them to hear the sounds of the neighboring group from a greater distance. When the neighboring group was far away, the chimpanzees were more likely to move deeper into the disputed area. When their rivals were nearby, the risk of an encounter increased, and moving further was no longer as rewarding. And this is where it becomes clear why chimpanzees patrol, scout, and repeatedly attack their neighbors in the first place. The winner can actually take their land. This is exactly what happened with the Ngogo chimpanzees. Between 1998 and 2008, researchers documented a series of fatal attacks on a neighboring community. Most of the victims were found in the same northeastern section of the border, an area that Ngogo males patrolled particularly often. Then their rivals began disappearing from the region. By 2009, the Ngogo chimpanzees were entering the area as if it were no longer foreign territory. They took over roughly 2.5 square miles of their neighbors' land. There were fruit trees in the new territory too, and it wasn't long before the chimpanzees started using them as a food source. At this point, it was no longer just a theory about why they killed their neighbors. For years, the group had patrolled the same border and killed those they found on the other side. Then the border itself simply shifted. The chimpanzees didn't just drive their neighbors away, they occupied the very place where their victims had once lived. There's also a strange pattern in these fatal attacks. Researchers compiled data on chimpanzee injuries from several long-term studies in Tanzania, Uganda, and Senegal. In total, they examined 1,268 injuries from non-fatal conflicts and another 258 injuries sustained during fatal attacks. But the dead males revealed a striking difference. Their genitals had been targeted far more often than could be explained by chance. Of the 258 injuries sustained in lethal attacks, 12 were to the male's genitals. In routine fights that didn't end in death, researchers found almost no comparable pattern. And that raises a question. Are they simply biting whatever they can reach? Or in a fight to the death, does the part of the body that allows a rival to reproduce become a particularly important target? The researchers specifically examined that possibility. Injuring the genitals can indeed prevent a competitor from reproducing, but there's still no proof that chimpanzees understand this and deliberately choose that target. There's also a simpler explanation. During a group killing, the victim's often pinned down or immobilized, making that part of the body especially easy to bite. But the pattern is real. While some chimpanzees are biting others where it hurts most, elsewhere they've begun attacking animals they never used to see as enemies at all. In Gabon's Luanga National Park, chimpanzees live alongside western lowland gorillas. Between 2014 and 2018, researchers observed 9 encounters between the two species, and every one of them was peaceful. Sometimes chimpanzees and gorillas even fed from the same fruit trees. Then everything changed. In 2019, scientists witnessed 2 very different confrontations. In both cases, a group of 27 chimpanzees encountered a much smaller group of gorillas. And the gorillas didn't simply run away, the adults defended themselves and fought back. During one of the clashes, a silverback even knocked a chimpanzee down, after which several male chimpanzees surrounded him and attacked all at once. But in both encounters, the main victims were infant gorillas. Both were killed. And that's what makes this especially strange. Chimpanzees normally carry out coordinated attacks like these against other chimpanzees. But here, almost the same tactics were suddenly directed at another species. Both clashes occurred along the borders of the chimpanzees' territory while they were out on patrol. But researchers still don't know exactly why the chimpanzees attacked the gorillas in the first place. One possibility is competition over food or territory. Another is hunting. After the second attack, an adult female chimpanzee ate almost the entire body of the dead infant. But after the first attack, the infant wasn't eaten at all. So for now, ordinary predation can't fully explain both incidents. Sometimes, however, unusual chimpanzee behavior develops for an entirely different region. In Uganda's Budongo forest, many chimpanzees suffered severe injuries from wire snares. Some lost fingers or could no longer move their hands properly, forcing them to perform familiar actions in completely new ways. But one male named Tinka proved especially interesting. Both of his arms were badly injured, and one hand was almost completely paralyzed. Because of this, Tinka couldn't scratch his back normally, so he came up with another method. He would pull down a hanging vine with his foot, press his body against it, and move from side to side. It worked like a natural back scratcher that required almost no use of his hands. For Tinka, this was a solution to a specific problem. But then researchers noticed something much stranger. Healthy young chimpanzees began doing exactly the same thing. 7 animals whose hands worked perfectly well and who had no need for this technique also began pulling down vines and rubbing themselves against them in almost exactly the same way. What's more, the behavior appeared specifically among chimpanzees that lived near Tinka and spent the most time around him. But chimpanzees' ability to invent new ways of doing things isn't limited to coping with injuries or obtaining food in familiar ways. In Fongoli, Senegal, researchers discovered chimpanzees making wooden tools for hunting. They would find a suitable branch, break it off, strip away the unnecessary parts, and sometimes further shape the end into a point. But the most remarkable part came afterward. The chimpanzees searched for tree hollows where small nocturnal primates known as galagos, or bush babies, hid during the day. Then they inserted a sharpened stick and repeatedly thrust it into the hollow with force. Researchers noted that the tool wasn't simply being used as a probe to drive the animal out. The chimpanzees were using it more like a spear. Do you understand what that means? A chimpanzee takes an ordinary branch, deliberately turns it into an actual weapon, finds the hiding place of another primate, and intentionally tries to injure it. And this wasn't an isolated incident. Researchers observed 22 such episodes involving 10 different chimpanzees. Until then, making tools to hunt vertebrates had been considered uniquely human. But now we know that other animals can also select an object for a specific purpose and then use it against another living creature. The very hands chimpanzees use to fashion weapons are capable of doing the exact opposite too. In Gabon's Luanga National Park, researchers observed an unusual behavior. Chimpanzees would catch small flying insects, crush them, and then apply them directly to open wounds, rubbing them across the injured area. During the study, this happened 22 times. In 19 cases, the chimpanzees were treating their own wounds. But on 3 occasions, they applied an insect to another chimpanzee's wound. In one of the first recorded cases, an adult female named Susie noticed an injury on her son's leg. She caught an insect, placed it in her mouth, then pressed it against the open wound and repeated the process several more times. Researchers still don't know exactly why they do this. One possibility is that the insects contain substances with anti-inflammatory or other beneficial properties. However, the insects themselves and the actual effects of this treatment have yet to be studied. Catching an insect to treat your own wound could still be explained as an attempt at self-care, but here an animal notices that another chimpanzee's injured, catches an insect, and applies it to the place where someone else is in pain. You know how people say that a healed femur is the earliest sign of civilization? Because it suggests that compassion already existed in prehistoric society. Well, it seems chimpanzees may be closer to us than we think. And they don't stop at insects. In Uganda's Budongo forest, researchers noticed that sick or injured chimpanzees sometimes began eating unusual parts of plants that aren't normally part of their diet. They may chew on bark, plant pith, and even wood, things that seem like a rather strange choice of food. So the scientists decided to examine these plants. They collected samples of the species the chimpanzees chose when they were sick, injured, or experiencing other health problems, prepared extracts from them, and tested those extracts in the laboratory. The results turned out to be far more interesting than a simple coincidence. Most of the extracts inhibited bacterial growth. Some also showed anti-inflammatory effects. A chimpanzee gets sick or injured, seeks out a plant it almost never eats, and then scientists take that plant into the lab only to discover that it has genuine medicinal properties that we humans didn't even know about. Of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that chimpanzees understand exactly which substances the plants contain or what conditions they treat. The researchers cautiously describe the behavior as a possible form of self-medication. But let's get back to conflict. Even within the same group, not all chimpanzees are equally willing to take risks. Over 32 years of observation, researchers identified a particular type of male, the impact patrollers. These males ventured to the edges of the group's territory more often than the others. And when one of them was nearby, the rest were much more likely to follow. Sometimes starting a dangerous expedition doesn't require the entire group to feel like fighting at the same time. All it takes is one instigator whom the others are used to following. The first chimp heads toward the border, a few others join him, and before long an entire group is formed. It's crowd mentality in its purest form. But sometimes a weaker chimpanzee doesn't need to fight a stronger one at all. In one experiment, two chimpanzees of different social ranks were seated side by side and given access to food. Normally, both could reach it, which meant the dominant male could easily take everything. The subordinate chimp, however, had the chance to redirect the food in advance, sending it to a place the dominant animal could no longer reach. So the stronger chimp can be the boss all he wants. Once the food's already moved to the other side, there's simply nothing left for him to take. And the weaker chimpanzees took full advantage of this. Whenever they could keep the food entirely for themselves and completely block the dominant rival's access to it, that was exactly what they did. So much for his dominance. But one chimpanzee went even further and began preparing objects in advance for future attacks. His name was Santino, and he lived at the Furuvik Zoo in Sweden. Staff noticed that the chimpanzee was constantly throwing stones at visitors. Then, while cleaning his enclosure, they found several piles of stones along the shoreline, carefully placed on the side where visitors usually stood. It turned out that Santino had been collecting them in advance, early in the morning, before any visitors arrived. Several hours later, when people began to appear, the chimpanzee would approach his prepared stockpiles and start throwing. But then the staff began removing his stones, so Santino changed his tactics. He began hiding some of his projectiles beneath piles of hay and behind structures near the visitors area. The stones remained within easy reach of the chimpanzee but were hidden from human view. During one observation, Santino waited until the visitors came closer again, retrieved a projectile he'd hidden earlier, and threw it. And at this point, it becomes difficult to dismiss his behavior as a simple outburst of aggression. Santino prepared the stones when there were no people anywhere nearby, and later he even began concealing them until the right moment. While making these preparations, he remained calm. Of course, Santino lived in captivity, so his behavior can't be directly applied to warfare among wild chimpanzees, but the fact remains, a chimpanzee is capable of preparing a weapon in advance for a situation that won't occur until several hours later. And when someone tries to find and take that weapon away, the chimpanzee can figure out how to hide it. But a group may also have chimpanzees that do the exact opposite. Researchers have observed that some chimpanzee communities developed genuine police officers. When two animals started fighting, one of these chimps would step in without taking either side. It might place itself between the opponents, drive them apart, or threaten both of them until the fight stopped. High-ranking chimpanzees were the ones most likely to take on this role. Their intervention was especially effective precisely because the others were rarely willing to attack such a powerful and influential member of the group. And these police officers tended to appear more often when tensions within the group were already running high. They weren't helping anyone win. On the contrary, they stopped the fight before the conflict could draw in everyone else. But wherever there's policing, a form of corruption's never far behind, because sometimes a chimpanzee can secure support in a fight ahead of time. Researchers noticed an interesting pattern. Males were more likely to side with individuals they regularly groom. One chimp would spend time grooming another and picking through its fur, and later it could expect that chimp to come to its aid during a conflict. So when a big fight's coming, strength isn't everything. It's better to have a chimpanzee on your side who already thinks you're great. Of course, it isn't a direct transaction along the lines of scratch my back and get one vote of support, but grooming helps create and maintain relationships, which can later develop into genuine coalitions, and sometimes a few peaceful minutes of grooming are enough to earn you an ally in the next conflict. That sounds like something from a commercial. Assuming chimps had commercials. See you later.